Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Grassroots Radio Conference Virtual Summit, the first ever of its kind. When we last met, it was in Rochester, New York, in a giant circle all together off the cusp of an amazing conference that was hosted by WXIR, WEO, and El Poder. As we were together there in a giant circle discussing the next Grassroots Radio Conference and how important it would be in the next presidential election, we certainly never imagined in a million years that we would not be enjoying this conference together in the same room, sharing the same space, and breathing the same air. Things that seemed so easy, so basic last year became so dangerous for us over the past course of the year. How could we ever imagine that our laughter, our hugs, our handshakes will become the lethal agents of a cruel and deadly disease? So much has changed since our time in Rochester. So many stations sound and feel completely different than they did this time last year. Many studios have been shut down. Many individuals have lost their access to the airwaves. But there's one thing that hasn't changed, and that is the importance of this conference in the 2020 election year. Radio is a powerhouse. Through its range, reach, and permeability, it has the power to change minds and to save lives, but only when used correctly, in the service of community. You know this, and this is why you are here. To increase your station's ability to amplify local voices, to respond to local emergencies, and to shape a better democracy. 2020 is a year of vision and clarity. And we are now seeing that our society has been built on pillars of false ideals, pillars of white supremacy that must be destroyed in order for us to come to a more just and equal society. There are many things that we hope to accomplish with this conference. And in addition to providing the skills and methods for keeping your station safe during COVID-19, we hope that the 2020 Grassroots Radio Conference will be an awakening of the grassroots community in which we recognize and destroy the racist principles within our own field. And we celebrate and foster the diversity that makes the Grassroots Radio Coalition such a rare and magical treat. For those of you who have been to the Grassroots Radio Conference before, I welcome you back. It's great to see so many familiar faces. For those of you who have never been to a Grassroots Radio Conference before, you may have already noticed that this event is unlike anything you've ever experienced. For over 20 years, the Grassroots Radio Conference has continued to exist because it does not exist at all. There's no formal organization behind this event. Rather, it is an annual gathering of community and college radio stations that is hosted by a different station in a different location each year. And 2020 was to be our year. We were so excited to have everybody here in Louisville, hosting you in our amazing, magical, wild town. And we were so excited to bring all our radio friends here, introduce you to our station and our staff in our unique and powerful city. Well, COVID-19 had different plans. And since then, you've all become introduced to our city in different ways, through the headlines in national news about a police force out of control and a young EMT who got caught in the crossfire. Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor has brought a new awareness to our city, and she's inspired a new generation to step up and fight the brutal inequalities that bring death and suffering to our communities of color, to fight the authorities who wield an aggressive and overarmed power against a community in pain. A community that more than anything wants their voices to be heard. 2020 has been an awakening for us in Louisville in so many ways. Every day we're reminded of the importance of our broadcast, of our ability to provide comfort, communication, and information to a society both shattered by isolation and united by a critical need for change. Were it not for the demons of this cruel pandemic, Louisville would have been such an amazing, exciting location for the Grassroots Radio Conference in 2020. And while we cannot be in person together this year. We're thankful for the technology that allows us to have this first ever Grassroots Radio Conference virtual summit. This is a new adventure for us all, and we're all getting accustomed to the new technologies and the new ways of meeting. And there's going to be bumps and glitches along the way, but we hope you'll have patience with us as we embark upon this new adventure. The amazing WXOX team is always up for a challenge, and they've worked so hard to bring this conference together for you, and I'm so looking forward to introducing you to them all. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us at any point during this conference and just say hello or let us know if there's anything that you need. We're so excited to have you here with us this weekend. And through our computer screens, we hope we'll give you a taste of Louisville and what this revolutionary town has to offer. So without further ado, I hope you'll enjoy your experience of the 2020 Grassroots Radio Conference. But most importantly, I hope that you'll emerge from this experience with the tools, skills, and connections that you need for defending American democracy and for amplifying justice in your community. Thank you so much. I'm Sharon Scott of Art FM WXOX, and welcome to the 2020 Grassroots Radio Conference Virtual Summit. Thank you so much for joining us.
I want to pop in real quick with you guys, and thank you, Sharon, so much. I just want to talk a little bit about our tech support resources, should you need them during the conference. We have a wonderful, not just tech support, but Discord channel where you can have a chat room. You want to continue the conversation after the conference. We also have a really wonderful Zoom party chat room, the Green Grassroots room, that will be open during the conference from 10 a.m. till midnight every day. If you want to pop in and have a video or voice chat, feel free to go over there. I have posted those links for you. You can get us on the tech support on Discord. You can also reach us. I think that's listed on the page as well. So I'm going to leave it there and send it to you, Tia.
All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Tia Marie, host, creator, and producer of the Tia Maria Show and Solo Radio, Tuesdays at 4 and 5 p.m. Thank you all so much for being here with us on this beautiful, gorgeous Friday morning. Listen, first of all, can we give it up for Sharon for that amazing greeting? Because I felt that all the way through. I felt it, okay? Even though we're not present, I felt that. But TGIF, y'all, it's an amazing day for this conference, and I'm so excited to be a part of it. As my teammates have said, we are in for a dynamic experience this whole weekend. We got an incredible list of speakers for this year's Grassroots Radio Conference. This is my first conference, so I'm excited to be here and definitely excited to be hosting it because we got some good energy here in Louisville. We're ready to give it to you for sure. Today is mind-blowing in and of itself, but none of this would be possible without our amazing supporters and sponsors who move mountains to make this all come together this weekend. So let me shout out the Pacifica Network, the SCMS Broadcast Equipment Solutions, Spinatron, Broadcast Tool and Die, Max Pixel Art and Design. Thank you all so much for your love and bless you for your continued support of our mission. So like I said, today's schedule of events is absolutely mind-blowing, and I'm not just saying that because I'm all over it. I'm saying this because we have secured the legendary MC Chuck D, the leader of Public Enemy, for our keynote conversation later today, hosted by me, your homegirl Tia Marie, which I'm so pumped about. So make sure you're here for that. That's at 5 p.m. today. And before that is the Radio Survivor podcast, which is all about community radio's role in covering the civil unrest happening all across the country. It'll be broadcasting live, and I'm also a part of that event discussing the Breonna Taylor tribute that my team and I produced. But today is full of amazing experiences. And of course, we're starting off strong this morning with our first panel titled Radio as Resistance. Come on, y'all, you already know what it is. So get ready for a powerful conversation that's gonna set the tone just right. Allow me to go ahead and toss it over to my Art FM teammate and your moderator for this panel, ElijahHumble, host of Humble Offerings on WXOX Louisville. Take it away, Elijah.
All right, thanks, Tia. Thanks again for you guys for joining us. And again, we're very thrilled to be hosting. And like Sharon said, we'd love to be able to show you around the town for real, because we're all just very proud of our town, and we love showing it off. And there's tons of fun things to do. So thanks again for joining us. And yeah, it's radio as resistance, right? So broadcasting anti-authoritarianism in Germany, South America, and the U.S. That's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get into that, just, we're a rock and roll station, we're a music station, just to bring it into focus for me. But I don't know, a few weeks ago, I was listening to one of our fine station or programs, The Deep End with Joey Mudd, normally focuses on Kentucky-related music, one of our flagship shows, I believe. But we all step out of lines with our programs sometimes, and he's playing some great Jimi Hendrix, just tearing it up. This I Don't Live Today, it's a song that has a lot of meaning right now. Just tearing it up and putting dishes away in the kitchen and just loving it. And then what happens, my phone just buzzes like, it's 8:30, it's curfew warning. There's a curfew in town, and 9 o'clock, you got to be in. So, and I just about broke down right there in the kitchen. Just, your mind starts to take these leaps. It's like, oh, it's 9 o'clock now, and maybe it's going to be 8 o'clock next time. It's going to be 6 o'clock. You need your ID if you go running, or if you go down to the liquor store or whatever. So, there's a lot of scary thoughts out there. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. But we have a fine panel of presenters here. We got Dr. Christine Ehrick from the University of Louisville. We got our own James Rooney, aka Cosmic Jim, I believe. This is a handle there with our fine program to come down on Sunday evenings, and Dr. Katherine Jewell at Fitchburg State in Massachusetts. And she's going to get us started today. She is the Associate Professor of History at Fitchburg State, and she's going to talk to us about Black Radio Ithaca up in Ithaca, New York, which is part of the Black Campus Movement at Cornell and other institutions in that area. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jewell.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers and to Sharon and for all of you for being here to talk about this. So I'm gonna start you out with a little bit of a story to set the scene, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implications and the lessons that we can take from it. So I want to transport you back to Cornell University in Ithaca on February 4th in 1973. In the Willard Straight Hall, which is the main kind of campus building in the center of campus, there was a group of DJs affiliated with a program called Sounds of Blackness that aired on several Ithaca college radio stations. And it was headed by a cross-institutional group called Black Radio Ithaca. There in Willard Straight Hall in that cold February, 350 juror spectators gathered to put Cornell University's WVBR FM and its progressive rock format on trial. There was a prosecutor who stood in front of the group and indicted the program director, Glenn Schiller, for his negligence. And he said his negligence to all listeners other than those that wish to listen to progressive rock. What they're putting on trial was Schiller's recent decision to eliminate all but a few hours dedicated to Black music in favor of continuity. This is the last straw for this group. Essentially, Schiller proposed integrating Black music into an otherwise white-dominated regular rotation. Schiller's advocacy for continuity was necessary, he said, to retain listeners, to prevent them from flipping the dial to another station. But Sounds of Blackness members were not convinced by this rationale. For example, if a Black DJ who occupied those hours of continuity opted for more Black artists than white on this regular show, they would be subject to dismissal for breaking the format. Schiller did not appear at his trial. Supposedly he was in class at the time, and he sent no witnesses on his behalf. So the judge presiding called upon the jury of peers for a verdict, knowing that its influence would be only symbolic at best, but resoundingly they cried guilty. The judge sentenced Schiller to reevaluate WVBR's schedule and its underlying programming philosophy to include a substantial increase in Black music and Black programming. WVBR's programmatic decisions, which Schiller had led, reflected deeper divisions within activist communities regarding access and representation, and it extended the ongoing Black campus movement into media. Essentially, Schiller's position offered an assimilationist vision for Cornell radio. He assumed a unified culture, one that established a normative white-dominated mainstream. The separation of Black music-focused programs and news and information were insultingly designated as specialty. This was the argument that the DJs in Black Radio Ithaca put forth in their trial. And they were subjected to repeated cuts, jarring schedule changes, but nonetheless, they maintained and grew significant power for community outreach, airing voices that were otherwise unavailable on commercial or even other non-commercial radio signals. So Schiller's plan essentially curtailed time for Black community members across universities and broke down relationships that were building between town and gown. And this debate took place within an unequal power structure. White students held the majority of positions of power at WVBR, as well as other campus institutions and student groups. Black students resorted to community pressure and the symbolic trial to try and influence their programming, given that they had a limited voice at the guild meetings, the governing body of the station, made up of elected managers. Schiller saw himself as acting on behalf of Black DJs and listeners and in the interest of community and cultural unity, espousing this integrationist and ultimately commercially driven vision for WVBR. As a community radio station, despite its university home, WVBR also had to satisfy advertisers, as it also had a strange status as a commercial radio station. But on the contrary, rather than holding up this commercial impetus for the station, Sounds of Blackness supporters instead showed that their program built important community bridges. Schiller, though, focused on white DJs and white listeners. He proposed to educate white DJs on the merits of Black music to create more coverage around the clock, and eliminating all minority programming, he argued, thus promoted that unity. But he ignored the larger meaning of Sounds of Blackness and its significance. Ultimately, he acted on a kind of market logic and an integrationist vision that served to silence Black voices. Sounds of Blackness was Black Radio Ithaca's space. It was their space to speak to whom they wanted, using the sounds and the information that they selected. The program symbolized not only Black students' presence and relationship to Cornell University, but also how their institutional participation yielded broader community and societal benefits. And it allowed them to control their own expression without having to seek white approval. They belonged to Cornell. Cornell belonged to them, just as their status as Americans and American citizens entitled them to space on the public's airwaves. So these college radio debates, such as that like Sounds of Blackness, signal that there were meaningful struggles taking place over American culture and institutional access, and what that access meant, and how it would change both universities and American culture more broadly. And what we're looking at here is really the essence of the culture wars. That the story and the way, and putting media and community and college radio at the center of that story transforms what we might understand the culture wars as being. That these are clashes that go much far beyond the halls of Congress or faculty senates or the sermonizing of televangelists or the pages of pundits' best-selling books. Instead, the culture wars can be found in these much messier, less visible maybe even more private terrain of local radio and entertainment among people who are much closer to music fans than to media titans and political consultants. So I could go on about the drama that unfolds and the voices, through the voices of the people at Cornell in 1970 and going forward. But instead, I'd like to just wrap it up by looking across the history of college radio more broadly to think about how this incident of Sounds of Blackness's cancellation and the mock trial can help us understand some of the lessons and some of the ways that community and college radio intersect with activism. So the first of these is that radio stations put an emphasis on public service. And so one of the ways that these stations serve activist causes is probably very recognizable through announcements of events, through public service announcements, but for ongoing activities. So a good example of this that kind of cuts across the history of college radio would be programming on International Women's Day or Martin Luther King Jr. programming for that day, anti-apartheid announcements in the 1980s. The goal is to reflect the efforts of other campus or community activist groups and to amplify what is going on outside of the station. The second way that we see this interaction take place is through regular programming and institution building. This often takes place under the umbrella of educational content, though still with a kind of public service component. And Black Radio Ithaca falls into this category, that this group undertook forms of public outreach and service that went beyond radio programming. Members of the group would visit a local correctional facility to meet with people who are incarcerated to try and coordinate programming in ways that met their needs. And so they had that kind of face-to-face interaction as well as one that took place over the airwaves. The bigger goal of this kind of programming and institution building is to change the sound of America, to create cultural change supported by institutions that would challenge normative media structures and culture. And so building institutions is key to that work. And then third relates to this kind of question of the nature of the programming itself, of this tension between continuity and specialty programming. That college and community radio are places where people find new muses for media. They re-envision what radio can be and what it should be. That they try to bring people and communities together to go beyond how media is envisioned and connect across institutional boundaries and organizations. The goal, ultimately, is to create the meaning and momentum that sustains activism and sustains a vibrant, diverse culture that reflects all of the residents of the United States. And of course, WXOX is a great example of this. So thank you, and I'll turn it back to the organizers if I figure out how to mute.
All right, thanks, Dr. Jewell. That was some great history there. So we didn't go over this, but if there's any questions, if you guys want to put in the chat box there, or we can, if there's none now, that's fine. We can come back to those later. But Dr. Jewell, anything else that you want to add? I know you mentioned on your bio you're part of the community, co-director of the College and Community Caucus of the Library of Congress Radio Preservation Task Force. So I'd maybe just throw out something about your involvement there and what that organization does.
Sure. So as writing this book on the history of college radio, I've had the chance to access a lot of the archival records related to radio and to understand their value, but also that these are an endangered resource, especially sound recordings. And so this caucus of the Library of Congress, which I also work with Jennifer Waits and Laura Schnittker, is to focus on preserving these resources and also showcasing some of their benefits, and to get people interested in the history of college and community radio and understanding its importance and working to preserve it, but also understand it and learn from it. So we hope to be having some projects that we launch soon, focusing on preservation, but also on highlighting some of the resources that are out there for access.
Cool. All right. We do have a question over here in the chat box, but could you comment on why Sounds of Blackness ultimately got canceled, and what were the reasons were given for that?
So one reason had to do with the peculiar market of Ithaca radio and the fact that this was a commercial station. And at this moment in 1973, this is sort of as the era of kind of 60s freeform radio is starting to wane, and commercial rock stations are beginning to adopt, a more regular formatting, more kind of commercial oriented formatting. And the leaders of that station, they saw themselves as having to compete with those other commercial stations. And even though they had the support of Cornell, they had space, the station was located in Willard Straight Hall, where the mock trial took place, they had to kind of balance the books, and they thought that this was going to be the best way to keep listeners. And so they kind of strayed from this idea that this was educational radio still, that was sort of the genesis of it. Eventually, Sounds of Blackness moves in 1974 to Ithaca's other radio station, which is mostly like a classical radio station, kind of a high culture station, and they debut new programming called Night Sounds, and it becomes a really important institution. I talked to people who would say, who are in Ithaca in the 70s, like, oh yeah, I would listen to that. And, so they kind of gained their own office space eventually. And I think the program went off the air in the 80s, in the early 80s. And so, they do kind of maintain independence. And in some ways that program, because it coordinated with other radio stations as well, the management structure at Cornell saw it as kind of undermining and kind of, leading people to go switch to other stations that, would then take them away from the Cornell radio station. So it was really this kind of market commercial mindset, which we don't think of when we think of college radio, that was actually very much in play in the 1970s, particularly for these commercial stations.
All right, thanks again. And then just another question: if your book about college radio is available, and maybe if you had a link, for some more information, you could throw in the chat box about that, Dr. Jewell. That would be cool. I know I've got it somewhere, but I've got about a dozen emails related to this floating around, so I probably can't find it quickly. But thanks again, and we may circle back and get you involved in the discussion later. But we're going to move on now. So Dr. Ehrick or James, it's kind of a toss-up which way we're going to go, but we're either going to discuss, go over to Europe and discuss, Germany, or South America and Central America with Dr. Ehrick. So I'm just going to put you guys on the spot. That's your pick.
Yeah, I can do either. I can go first if Dr. Ehrick would prefer to, kind of wrap everything up, if that would be cool.
I suppose if we're going to go chronologically, you go first, right?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so.
Go ahead.
Awesome. All right, well, also, just thanks for having me here. I love WXOX, obviously. We have the best radio programs in the country, so, so it's about time we put on a heck of a conference as well. And, I wish we were all meeting in person. That would be way cooler, but this is working and is actually pretty innovative, I feel like. So yeah, so we're going to talk about Germany. We're going to talk about America and Germany, and we're going to talk about how we can learn, maybe some techniques in providing our community a greater voice, in using our own techniques that we used to fight fascism once before. So 2020 has now been the year that the violent intentions of right-wing groups received a full-throated endorsement of a sitting president. As protests broke out across the nation, sparked by the murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, police forces and unofficial civilian gangs of armed white men took to the streets to defend public property. Anyone with common sense knew what they were really fighting for: maintaining the status quo, the written and unwritten laws of American society that demand Black Americans remain subservient and silent in the face of institutionalized racism. As peaceful protesters were subjected to violence at the hands of those supposed to serve and protect, demonstrations intensified. States called in the National Guard. In Louisville, David McAtee was murdered. In Portland, unmarked vans with unidentifiable agents descended onto the masses. American citizens were detained and disappeared for days. The president commended these actions as the practice spread to other large cities. This year has made clear the fascist intent of the current administration and the American right as a whole. The blatant power grabs through brute force and legislative abuse is a desperate attempt at illegitimate minoritarian governance for America. Seeing public opinion moving in favor of those protesting for racial justice, it was essential to become violent, egg on protesters, and paint the Black Lives Matter movement and those resisting fascism as extremists, violent, or that American watchword communist, which we have seen a lot lately. In response to this, we have seen a record high turnout at the polls, voter registrations, a broad acceptance of progressive policies, increased community involvement, and a general improvement in how informed the public has become. Which is also a reminder, if you are in Kentucky, today is the last day to submit your request for your mail-in ballot, so get that ballot in. Americans are becoming more involved in demonstrating their disapproval in a government selected by the few. Social media and a fast-paced national corporate media have presented a window into the dealings of dilemmas across the country within seconds of news breaking. While this does create problems, fake information on social media, partisan bias in the corporate media, we are able to access information at an unprecedented rate. In many ways, this can be assessed as the start of the decline of the information age, where we become victims to the sheer amount of available data and updates. There is one tool, however, that sparked this era, still relevant, though forgotten by many. It is an irreplaceable asset, and that is our airwaves. In particular, small grassroots community radio stations. The hyperlocality of community radio allows broadcasters to connect with those in their distinct areas, to discuss the issues at hand that directly impact their listeners. While the next big story may leave behind certain coverage on the national news, grassroots radio can keep the story on what matters at that moment for the community they serve. Just look at coverage of Louisville's protest for Breonna Taylor. National news were here for one weekend when they believed a high degree of violence would break out. It did not. So they left in search of the next big ratings piece. Protests have continued, largely uncovered by the national media, for over 100 days. It's the trust that listeners place in their community broadcasters that present these stations, both individually and as a national network, the opportunity to work toward fighting the implementation of American fascism. Interestingly enough, the model for doing so exists in our own past dealings with stamping out this threat in post-war Germany. Following the Second World War, with the atrocities of National Socialism and the Holocaust burned into the public consciousness, Germany was placed under the military governorship of the occupying Allied powers. The primary goal of this process was to rid lingering fascism and Nazism from the defeated country. While broadcasting served as a key component of Nazi Germany's propaganda machine, this very same medium, as best preserved from the ruins of 1945 Germany, was selected by Germans and allies alike to act as the vehicle for public interaction and reconstruction that would lead Germany into a progressive, democratic, and experimental future. For the sake of this presentation, I would like to look at three aspects of post-war German radio that facilitated denazification, and those are going to be entertainment, the organization, and news and public engagement. Of course, regarding the organization of these stations, it was essential to wipe away all public influence of Nazi Party members or those with fascist sympathies. This is not solely limited to public figures, but also private individuals who may display prominent influence, as Joint Chiefs of Staff Document Directive 1067 stated. All members of the Nazi Party who have been more than a nominal participant in its activities, all active supporters of Nazism or militarism, and all other persons hostile to Allied purposes will be removed and excluded from public office and from positions of importance in quasi-public and private enterprises such as civic, economic, and labor organizations, the press, publishing houses, and other agencies disseminating news and propaganda. This required the removal of numerous media personnel and public figures from their positions at radio stations, newspapers, and public office. This also affected the overall content and style of German media. In order to provide stability and meet the objectives of the US, radio was placed in the category of public broadcasting, just as it was during the Third Reich. The success of the British Broadcasting Company over the last quarter century contributed to this. It was feared that the American model would present the opportunity for capital-backed interest groups to dominate the frequencies. Keeping a public service model in mind, it should be acknowledged that there was only an extent to which this model could have genuinely benefited Germany's interests. Broadcasting was a tool of occupation, thus making it impossible to grant every interest a voice over the air. Although presented as public service, occupation broadcasting was always intended to be a path toward the creation of a German public that was no longer capable of supporting undemocratic ambitions and policies. This model overwhelmingly presented material and programming that would act in accordance with what the Allies felt Germany's best interest was. This furthers the notion of an Allied-endorsed democratic propaganda of sorts, although it is one that most people agree is pretty good, given that Germany came out from this as a stable democracy, pretty fascist free. And of course, they're still, dealing with their own problems, as is every nation is right now, with sort of a right-wing emerging fringe parties and growing sentiment against those more progressive policies being implemented. Now, regarding entertainment, this one I feel is a little more relatable to us here at WXOX. And big is the question of music. It's a difficult question to navigate because of the propagandistic nature of music during the Third Reich. Occupiers were faced with a number of questions which lacked a pretty clear-cut answer. The most immediate concern was the elimination of influences from concert halls and major orchestras. To facilitate this goal, Nazi sympathizers were removed from positions of authority, or if they were a composer working closely with the Reich government, their music would have been removed from performance. As we all know, Hitler and the Nazi Party manipulated German music to demonstrate continuity between their dictatorship and the rich cultural tradition of Germany's past. In order to properly address issues with German culture, broadcasters could not convey the antiquated notions of German superiority. Changing the German public's opinion of their heroic national artists required undoing a belief system that tied national identity to the prominent character traits of those selected individuals. In some situations, the Allies implemented a policy of censoring music of composers directly associated with the Reich, such as Richard Strauss, or with those fueling the racial and cultural superiority complexes that we saw so often in the writings of Richard Wagner, that blatant anti-Semitism and German supremacy sort of deal. The whole, Teutonic might and whatnot, sorrow, greatness through suffering is the big quote. While it seems that this strategy would fulfill the Allied goal of denazifying Germany, a series of issues remain. Censorship alone would seem to discredit those democratic credentials of the occupying powers, but also allowing those frequent performances from those artists would reinforce those assertions made by the Nazi government. As stated, Allies initially dictated what music could work, and those who were included, Wagner, Strauss, gone. They got to go. Beethoven, however, there are certain pieces that can be played. We saw where the Third and Seventh Symphonies, which were often used in Nazi functions, they're thrown out immediately. But there are other works by Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, Schubert, who can all be played. Bach was seen is a champion of the great Protestant humanist, sort of. They never necessarily tied him to any of that superiority logic or anything like that. It was more of a humanitarian nature that we see. And so by limiting these, German broadcasters prevented sort of that nostalgic resurgence of Nazi sympathy. Occupying music officers also revived compositions by French and English composers, which were banned during the Nazi years. And we also saw a big amount of reintroduction of Jewish composers. One really interesting piece on this was on Nordwestdeutsche Rundfunk, which is, Northwest German Broadcasting, and they had a Beethoven biographical play where audiences, they're presented with portions of Beethoven's worldview throughout the course of the program. They go into one particularly interesting moment is they go into Beethoven's Eroica dedication, which was originally supposed to be a dedication to Napoleon Bonaparte, of when he was consul of the French, and he felt that he embodied those French revolutionary ideals and the ambitions of the Enlightenment. But of course, Napoleon doesn't sit well just being consul, and he moves on to Emperor Napoleon. And there's a section in here where the narrator is having a fictional interview with Ferdinand Ries, a student who became a friend of Beethoven. And when the topic of Napoleon comes up, Ries explains, "I was the first who brought him the news that Bonaparte had declared himself emperor, whereupon he flew into a rage and cried out, 'Is he no more ordinary a man? All human rights will be trampled underfoot only to indulge in his ambition. He will now, like all of the rest, become a tyrant.'" The composer, upon hearing the death of Bonaparte, consul of the French Revolution, and the birth of Emperor Napoleon, destroyed his dedication page. He was no longer fit for the heroic symphony of Eroica. And we see this program, with Napoleon acting as Adolf Hitler in this case, where Beethoven is painted as a Democrat, where, we have a democratic Beethoven. While he couldn't actually rally against the Nazis, we have, the producers of this program found a way to make him, right there in it, taking that high German figure and applying it to their modern situation of stamping out fascism and stamping out Nazism. Also, I'd like to, just to wrap up this sort of section, talk about Northwestdeutsche Rundfunk's the Rundfunkschule, which is a broadcasting school, to ensure that their station was putting out innovative, still compliant material with the occupying powers. They started a broadcasting school, which was a training center for journalists and the directors of these stations. And then until 1948, they were just training everybody, getting them in line with what German broadcasting would look like. And we see this move on to more of a general, almost like a trade school for journalists, getting into the field. They invested a ton of money and resources into this, which was really great. It became more of the function, and it's, the direct quote is, "The function of the school was transformed into something similar to a training center, which brought together relevant groups of the radio community," which is similar to this conference we're having today. We're gathering, we're discussing what we need to do. How do we move forward in our current moment in time? What can we do to make the world more fair and just? How do we get over those egregiances of which, that we had before? This school developed programs like the Cultural Word, Kulturelles Wort, where they would take public opinion. They would have submissions to the station. One particular episode was the 29th of January, where everybody could submit to the station what they did on the 29th of January, 1947. This program divided the day into vignettes from midnight to midnight, where you got a really cool account of the day. You had a student's Kant lectures. You had a father thinking about his family, how they will find food, how they will find heat, how they, what is the nation up to? Programs like this, they were telling listeners what was going on every day in a rapidly changing Germany of the occupation years. We had addresses on the general state of the nation, international affairs, the minute details of how their And during these times alone, it was this last point that really, you know, allowed post-war broadcasting to excel, sparking this dialogue among and with its listenership, and it connected German communities in this shared experience that everybody is going through. And for the most part, overall, like I said, Germany is a stable democracy now. That, of course, broadcasting is not the only factor, but it's getting in there, and it was taking over this sort of, you know, how we want to see things move forward. And what can grassroots stations take from this? You know, this very conference alone is a huge deal. This is awesome. You know, our response to Breonna Taylor, our dedication, we had a collaborative effort with dozens and dozens of stations all around the world. You know, we are definitely coming together. We have to continue this. We need to commit to be sure that our staff looks like the community we represent, make sure that we have those voices on air. Regarding the music at our station, for the most part, WXOX, I can attest to, already does this. You know, sadly, we are able to repurpose music from different eras that really fit our needs today. The civil rights anthems pieces are still super relevant. We have to commit to new artist exposure, especially those who are on the correct side of history. Those are hoping to make social change and progress. News and engagement. Continue to cater and work for the communities we represent. Attain greater community involvement. We've seen this. There's a show, Be Here, I believe, with Emily and Demi, and they had a prominent Louisville activist on there who they've been doing interviews with. They do great interviews with everybody. They've been down there at Injustice Square, taking interviews, getting that firsthand look that we saw, you know, in German broadcasting at this time. We are taking it, you know, the person of the people, you know, out there. And really, you know, one thing we could focus on, I think, would be possibly trained, if every community radio station could have somebody with those journalist credentials where we could train other broadcasters. We could train and have some sort of news team almost at every one of these stations, which is a hard process to do, especially as we are all volunteer run and everything. But, you know, yeah, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I think if we look toward our past and look at what we've used to fight fascism, fight authoritarianism, I'd say we are making great strides. And I'm speaking just from WXOX's perspective here, but I think we've done a killer job, just a marvelous job. And that wraps it up. And I'm rambling.
Oh, all right. Cosmic Jim. Thanks a lot for that. Some great history there being shared, and we really appreciate it. We're going to turn it over to Dr. Chris Ehrick here with the University of Louisville. She is a professor of history, also the Transnational Director of the Radio Preservation Task Force, and she's going to talk about, you know, the fascism and the radio waves in South America. I think one thing we can come back to, because she's going to talk about, you know, the more positive things on the resistance side, but just, you know, the misinformation we're seeing now and how that relates to you know, when dictatorships are on the rise, more so than, you know, the kind of cleansing afterwards that James had gone into. So maybe we can save that for after Dr. Ehrick does her thing. So I'll turn it over to her.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Elijah, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this. And it's really cool to share a panel with James, who's a former student of mine from a few years back. So that's very exciting.
Very cool.
Yeah. So, I want to focus on the right, as you said, Elijah, kind of the other side of this, which is, you know, what's going on, you know, in terms of this anti-fascist broadcasting when you're in the middle of it, not when you're on the backside of it. So imagine a world where suddenly the only source of information about current events was Fox News. Like most authoritarian regimes, the military dictatorships that ruled over the southern cone nations of Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile in the 1970s and 1980s imposed strict censorship and restricted access of citizens to alternative and/or anti-regime media. So television, with its higher kind of tech requirements and lower broadcast range, TV was relatively easy for these military regimes to control. Radio was another story, right? Radio was never really ever entirely controllable. And you did have during these places kind of clandestine broadcasts that were coming from within the borders of these countries, but these were a little more furtive and much more dangerous. But what really provided a source of alternative information and messages of encouragement, et cetera, for people living under these right-wing dictatorships were broadcasts that were coming from abroad. Either long-wave broadcasts that are coming just over the border, or in some cases, shortwave broadcasts that were coming from quite a distance away. So what I want to talk about today are really briefly two examples. One is the Uruguayan station, a station that still exists, Radio Colonia, which was a long-wave station. Colonia is basically right across the river from Buenos Aires in Argentina. And so this was a station that broadcast primarily to Argentine listeners. And I'm focusing on this period of military rule from the 1960s to the 1980s. And the other program I want to talk about is a radio program titled Escucha Chile, Listen Chile, which was a long-running program of Chilean exiles that was hosted by Radio Moscow. So people picked it up via shortwave. So in keeping with one of the themes of this conference, what we have here are two examples of radio kind of squeezing through the cracks of the authoritarian walls of propaganda and censorship, providing not only information, but also support and solidarity to listeners living under the terror and isolation of right-wing authoritarianism. Okay, so Radio Colonia, as I said, the town of Colonia is basically right across the river from Buenos Aires and in close proximity to a lot of the surrounding regions in terms of broadcast range. And Uruguay historically has often been host to Argentine political exiles of various different stripes and over a long period of time. By the 1930s and 1940s, of course, radio became an important tool of these exiles who could essentially lob, opposition broadcasts across the river to audiences in Argentina from the relative safety of being in another country. Although it was constantly a source of tension between the two countries, as you might imagine. Now, by the time we get to the 1960s and 1970s, the political situation in much of Latin America in the wake of the Cuban Revolution and all of that, right? There's a lot of radicalization that's going on. And the response to a growing activism and radicalization of the left in many parts of the region was the establishment of basically right-wing authoritarian military regimes, typically with the support and endorsement of the United States. And various kinds of concerted efforts to literally and figuratively shut down, eliminate any kind of leftist opposition that was usually labeled as terrorism or subversion or whatever kind of terms that were used to label and eliminate any voices that were opposed to military rule. From like the early 1960s and through the early 1980s, Radio Colonia was a crucial window for Argentines seeking a reality other than what that was being served up by these authoritarian and military regimes. Now, this is curious because in this particular case, this is a question I don't really have an answer to yet. It's a little surprising that Uruguay remained a location of opposition broadcasting, given that in theory, these two right-wing military regimes were allies with each other. Clearly, there's a more complicated story there that we're still trying to kind of figure out of why it was that this radio station, Radio Colonia, was essentially allowed to continue to broadcast these messages into Argentina, given that the government on the ground in Uruguay was, at least in theory, of the same authoritarian kind of right-wing authoritarian mindset. But leaving that aside for now. One of the most important and well-remembered, and Radio Colonia is a really important part of the memory, the popular memory of Argentines of military rule. It was seen as it was this lifeline. It was a thing you could tune into to try to find out what's really going on, both in your country and outside, and how people are outsiders thinking about this regime and the human rights violations that were taking place. In that popular memory, the voice people most associate with Radio Colonia was a guy named Ariel Delgado, who was he was the director and the main news reporter guy on Radio Colonia from around 1960 to around 1980 with some breaks in between. And Delgado, was very much committed to keeping Argentines up to speed on what was really happening in their country, particularly in times of crisis. As he explained, what was typically the case is that if there was really something going on, if something was really bad during the military dictatorship in Argentina, you might turn on your radio and all you hear are military marches, which was usually your sign, like your indication, like, oh shit, what's going down? What's actually happening? And that's when people would really tune into Radio Colonia to try to find out what was actually happening that wasn't being broadcast. But people also, there were also ways in which this radio station was a kind of psychological defense and benefit to people who were living through the military regime, even including those who had been detained, who were detained in torture and detention centers during this time. So Delgado himself related a story about the arrest and torture of well-known Argentine journalist, a guy named Eduardo Josami, who spent 8 years in a number of different clandestine military detention centers during this time. And Josami himself related a story of describing his detention and torture in his memoirs. So translating here, tied to the stretcher where I always was in those days, I heard information from Radio Colonia. And in between the laughter of my kidnappers who, pretending to be insulted, yelled, "The media are such liars." The radio news mentioned the demonstrations that were taking place demanding my release. Those demands filled me with joy. I shared the story at a press conference when I was finally released, and Radio Colonia later used for their own publicity. Delgado remained on Radio Colonia through about 1980. Of course, the problem was that he wasn't in Argentina, but they were not that far away. And as things continued, once we get into around 1979, 1980, the pressure is increasing, and he basically decides that it's time to leave, right? That he needs to go somewhere farther away. So he left the station and spent a couple of years in Italy, and then he actually spent a couple of years as a broadcaster on the Sandinista-controlled Radio Nicaragua in the early 1980s. The station, even after his departure, continued to basically fulfill its function, and it also played a really important role during the Malvinas or Falklands War in the early 1980s, providing people again with alternative to the military propaganda and censorship that was airing on stations otherwise. And so it will continue to play a really important role as military rule is winding down in the early to mid 1980s. Now, in the case of Chile, right, we have a very different situation. Whereas in Argentina and Uruguay, the left never really achieved any kind of power. In Chile, of course, as we may know, right, there from 1970 to 1973, Chile was led by the socialist president Salvador Allende, who had come to power on the kind of backs of a larger coalition, Popular Front coalition of various leftist parties who were committed to achieving socialism through the Chilean way, which meant, through democratic methods and through a kind of democratic socialism. But of course, despite the commitment of the left to democracy, as something we're familiar with, the right wing had no such commitment to that idea of democracy. And we do see on September 11th, 1973, the armed overthrow, US-sponsored military coup, which overthrew the Allende government and established the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, which lasted until well into the 1980s. Now, but because the left had power in Chile, this changes the calculation a little bit in terms of how this opposition radio will be set up once once Pinochet is in power. So the left had a lot of access to radio during the Allende years. And so you had the Socialist Party had their radio station. And more importantly for this story, the Chilean Communist Party had essentially their official radio station, which was called Radio Magallanes. And this was actually one of the last stations, it was on the airwaves of Radio Magallanes where Chileans last heard the words of their president Allende, who broadcast a final message to the country on September 11th, 1973, before he died in the presidential palace on that day. these stations were also, the left stations associated with Allende were also bombed on that day. But the existence of this communist radio station, which already had, because of political party affiliation, had existing relationship with Radio Moscow, will set the stage for a very different type of process during the Pinochet years. So as the story goes, on the same day of the coup of September 11th, 1973, the Spanish-speaking division of Radio Moscow began looking for a voice they could put on the air to denounce what was happening in Chile. And they were able to locate Chilean communist leader Volodya Teitelboim, who was on that day reportedly in Italy. So he was immediately dispatched, relocated to Moscow, and was put on the air. And this was the genesis of this program, Escucha Chile, that would air daily in the early AM hours, Moscow time, so that it was the right time in Chile, from September of 1973 all the way to March of 1990. Many other exiled journalists would follow, and you had the establishment of what was a fairly robust journalistic team, mostly of exiled Chileans, but others were involved in it as well. Teitelboim later described the program as a, quote, supersonic airplane of words, especially because in the early years of the dictatorship, a near total censorship was imposed, and Chileans could only learn what was going on in the country by listening to broadcasts from abroad, Radio Moscow, Radio Havana, etc. So Escucha Chile was basically an auditory lifeline for Chileans, both inside and outside of the country. While within Chile, it was listened to in secret and at no small risk. In the voices of Escucha Chile, were protected by both physical distance and the support of a superpower, which meant a very different situation from Radio Colonia, whose situation and the safety of their broadcasters was always a lot more precarious. One of the voices, I'm sort of looking at my time here. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. So I think it's important. There's a couple of things that I think are important. One is to underscore that this was a little bit of an exception in what was normally not especially a kind of pluralistic broadcasting tradition in Radio Moscow. Escucha Chile was a little bit of an exception, but it also reminds us of the important role that Radio Moscow played in this case. We're really accustomed to narratives surrounding broadcasters like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe as defenders of human rights and democracy, even if that wasn't always the case. But here we have an example of the official radio voice of the Soviet Union, while certainly not politically disinterested, standing undeniably on the side of democracy, free speech, and human rights. It shouldn't be overstated, but it needs to be acknowledged. So the media environment, of course, has changed a lot since the 1970s, but I would argue, and I'm sure many folks attending this conference would agree, that radio remains an important, low-tech, analog communication technology that remains a vital tool in times of emergency, whether that emergency is a natural disaster or more political in nature. Radio is a media of first resort, but it is also a media of last resort, inherently democratic and potentially subversive. So I wanted to wrap up by thanking all of you community radio folks for what you do, and thanking you for the vital service that you provide at all times, but maybe especially in the current moment, and to acknowledge the importance of radio as a firewall, sometimes maybe the last firewall of a free society. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Dr. Ehrick. That was some more great history. So we appreciate you guys sharing that with us. And then we did get one question in the chat I'll come to in a second, but just, kind of what I mentioned before, just you talking about, in the current time, the misinformation that's out there, what some of these other dictatorships and even in Ithaca, New York, how they kind of control the message and that sort of thing to kind of lock down their position. So just, if you guys could throw out some more specific examples of that type of thing that you guys have studied. If you guys have anything to share there.
Sorry, can you repeat what? Can you repeat?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, just more specific examples of of how these dictatorships, like as they grew in power, and like how they kind of locked down you know, how they shut certain things off and what kind of their game plan was. You know, I mean, obviously bombing radio stations, that's a pretty direct way to do it. But other, you know, more subtle methods that they use to kind of control that message. You know, Goebbels in Germany obviously was very slick about how he did a lot of that stuff. But then, you know, on the Allied side, you know, they did some of that too, dropping flyers out of the sky and that sort of thing. So I think that stuff's fascinating. So just any other examples you guys had of that?
Yeah. There's a real blatant example in Germany where the manufacturing of radios, they called them the Volksempfänger, which is like the people's broadcaster, the people's radio, where it was programmed to where it couldn't pick up any stations outside of Germany. It could only pick up national frequencies. And if those were tampered with and you were caught with one that had been, you know, like jailbreaking your iPhone or whatever, you know, you just straight to jail. There you go. So, you know, that's a pretty good one where you could only buy German radios produced in Germany after this rate. If you had one of the old, you know, the old radios with the crystals in them and such, you know, they'd find you and lock you up. So it just the blatant inaccessibility to technology that would work as well is kind of there.
Cool. That's a great example. The other folks had some?
Yeah, I mean, there were a number of different strategies. Obviously, you have, you know, various kinds of direct and indirect takeover of, you know, the more commercial broadcasting apparatus. That's important. There were certainly efforts made in the case of Radio Colonia. There were efforts made to block the signal. There were various parabolic antennas that were put up to try to block the signal. I mean, there were different efforts that were made. And certainly you had to be, I mean, going back to kind of James's point, I mean, you know, getting caught listening to any of these broadcasts could certainly get you in a lot of trouble. But yeah, the regimes themselves, I'm going to be able to in about a week would be able to give you a much better answer, because there's going to be a great virtual conference on TV and dictatorship in the Southern Cone coming up next week, which I'm really looking forward to, because I think the TV question is interesting, and part of it is, you know, again, the usual strategies of also just distracting people, right? You pretend that it's not happening, you distract people with a lot of kind of superficial entertainment. And so part of it was also just kind of filling the void, so that especially, you know, as I'm sure you know, and particularly in the case of Argentina, but also in Chile, the strategy was of simply disappearing enemies of the regime, but in an unofficial way. And so, you know, officially none of that was happening. So media was also about trying to just maintain the fiction that what seems to be happening outside your door is not really happening, right? And that if it did, well, the people who are being disappeared must have done something to deserve it. But I think it's a really interesting question, and as I said, especially the TV question, I'm really looking forward to. I think the radio, there's been so little work that's been done on this topic of radio and dictatorship, especially outside of Chile. The Chileans have done some really good work on it, but yeah, hopefully we're going to get a little more information about the specific details coming up, which I'm looking forward to.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks again for sharing that. Again, you doctors there, Dr. Ehrick and Dr. Jewell. I know, Dr. Jewell, you mentioned your book. You put a link in there. And Dr. Ehrick, did you have a book that you put together kind of on this topic, or is that something you're working on?
Yeah, not on this topic yet. This is something that we're working on. It's a project I'm working on with two research collaborators, one in Uruguay and one in Argentina. Everything, as you can imagine, has been stalled a little bit, the research part of it, because of the pandemic, which is affecting all of us. So we are still kind of working to put stuff together. So yeah, I don't really have anything that's officially been published yet on this topic, but hopefully soon.
Cool. Sounds good. Then just a couple questions in the chat. We are winding down here to get to our next session. But this one goes back to James. I don't know if you saw that in the chat there, but just the argument that, forced suppression of Nazi sympathizer types, and forced propaganda, on the democracy side, is that a good methodology for community radio to follow? Again, just the whole deal of, we got the suppressed and then things swing back the other way, and it's kind of reverse suppression. You can make that argument. So just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that was a little more backing information, sort of just kind of cleansing, the airwaves of those Nazi sympathizers. But coming down specifically to community radio, I think that it is our job to represent the views of our community, of those listeners that we represent. And I do think that most of our listeners, speaking from WXOX perspective, would not like Nazis and fascists on the radio. So I'd say maybe them, I think there would be calls for them to be removed from our community that we represent.
Great. And then one other question here, and we'll finish it up. But the question is, we're living at a time where worldwide grassroots radio stations can organize and offer that kind of same bulwark for independent media. That like Radio Moscow offered for Chile. Just kind of the size and the strength of what type of organization you need to really make a difference. And there's advantages of being more mobile now, but you still have to grow. And it's like, how do you reach new audiences, and how do you grow that movement? So that might be one to finish up with, if you guys had some thoughts on that. Again, without being tied, a lot of it comes, like in Ithaca with the money, it's a corporate kind of situation. And, like the Warren Zevon lawyers, guns and money. I mean, that's where dictators play that game as far as appointing judges and all that stuff. But I think that's an interesting point to consider. It's like, how do you grow a movement, when you're a grassroots station?
I think what we're doing right now is a pretty good start. I think that there are enough of us across the nation. Again, we saw with our Breonna Taylor dedication how many stations showed up. We had a lot of power at that moment. That was a big moment. I think just opening channels between all these grassroots stations creates, sets those conditions for the possibility of us acting as a bulwark to this rising fascist sentiment, or rising just insanity that we see every day on the news, sort of going on.
All right, thanks for sharing that. And then Dr. Jewell, is there anything else you would like to add before we finish up?
Well, I think it's sort of interesting to juxtapose university administrators with authoritarian dictators. Maybe some of us have certain sentiments one way or the other, depending on who your president is. But I think the role of the license holder is something really important. Sharon and I are both Sharon Scott and I are both graduates of WRVU at Vanderbilt, whose license was sold. That the administration usually owns the licenses of college stations, and they ultimately have a lot of power over them. So, who owns the license is tremendously important, and these kind of dry sort of regulatory questions and policy questions also factor into what the people are going to be able to do with the airwaves.
All right, yeah, that's a great point. The licensing a lot goes into that, and to maintain that, so that's a huge factor. I think with that, folks, we're going to finish it up. Let me just give you some more recognition of our sponsors here. Grassroots stations are more important than ever to a global listenership in distress. We would like to thank our sponsors that recognize the importance of college and community radio and its Pacifica network: SCMS Broadcast Equipment Solutions, Spinatron Broadcast Tool and Die, and Mad Pixel Art and Design. So with that, our next session is at 12:30. Tools in the Toolbox, Options for Working Remotely.